I'm going to work that 22 and 24 with you on it, and hopefully that will make sense. Mostly so that you can understand just that thought pattern of, if I come up to a question and I don't know something, how can I use what I know to figure out what I don't know with those same questions? So that's kind of going to be my goal with that versus just telling you what it is. All right, I'm going to flip this around here. All right, so for question 22 here, we have y equals negative absolute value of x plus 1. So the question, just like we were asking with slope, here where we knew we have a y-intercept and then we've got this slope is the coefficient of it, and the slope tells us the steepness of the line. In the same way with absolute value ones, we still have a y-intercept. So this is still going to be our y-intercept. Why is that our y-intercept? Because if x equals 0, so remember our y-intercept is always when x equals 0 and we're looking for the y number. So if x equals 0, y equals 1, right? Because it removes that whole thing. So if x equals 0, y equals 1. We know this is a valid coordinate point for this graph. The other question, just like when we were doing our slope, and if our slope was -3, we knew that our line was going to be negative going down. If our slope was +3, we knew that our line was going to be positive going up. This negative coefficient automatically tells our brain, I have a negative graph. So when we're looking at an absolute value graph, it's either going to be facing up or it's going to be facing down. So if it's a positive, it's going to be facing up like a cup. If it's down, it's going to be emptied out. So those are the clues that we can get from our equation when we have just started. We know our y-intercept, so we know that 0, 1 is a value. We know that our graph is going to be facing down. So at what point do they face down? So what we work through is when the other points that we want to find, we know when x equals 0 what y is. So then our other question is when y equals 0. If y equals 0, what happens? So I have 0 equals negative absolute value of x plus 1. So we are looking for x. I'm going to move my -1 over. And I'm going to get -1 equals negative absolute value of x. Well, I have got a negative on the left side and a negative on the right side. I can multiply my entire equation by -1, and I get 1 equals the absolute value of x. There. So what have we learned about absolute value? Absolute value means that you have both a positive and a negative value that can end up being your equal sign. So x could be a +1, and that would give us the value of 1, or x could also be a -1, and that would still give us the answer of 1. So when y equals 0, I have both +1 and -1 as my options. So now I have 3 points. So if we're graphing, I'm going to have 0, 1 is going to be my vertex. Then I have +1, 0, and -1, 0 are 2 more points. And we're just going to graph that line. Oops. I'm looking through the camera. Grab that line through there. So we're going to have this V, and it's pointing down, which it told us initially it was pointing down. So that's a check mark. We know that our y-intercept is going to be our vertex on this point, and that's just because we didn't have anything else added. I was explaining when you add something to the x value, it moves it left and right. And then we just find 2 more points, which we know the easiest way to find those points are to find those intercepts because we're plugging in zeros into those numbers. You could go ahead and and find some other ones, if y equals -1, what would x be? You could solve things like that and get more points. Just the intercepts are going to be the easiest points for you to find. Another thing to note, just as extra information, is that this is the same, almost basically the same as y equals x. We just are having that positive and negative value of x because it's absolute value. And we know that y equals x is our 45-degree line. So it's the one that's going straight, it's cutting straight through the middle. So that's like what I typically call our baseline or our basic line. So what's interesting about absolute value, just a heads up, is that just like when our slope was less than 1, then our slope goes down, is more shallow whenever it's less than 1. So it opens up more. Same thing when this coefficient for the absolute value is less than 1, then your lines are going to get wider because they're following in that shallower part. If your slope or your coefficient or your slope initially was greater than 1, like we did with the 3, so our slope is 3, so it's a lot steeper here. If the coefficient of your absolute value is greater than 1, it's just like having that slope of 3x, and so your graph is going to be your absolute value graph is going to be a lot skinnier in that way. So the best thing to think about is if you were to think about y equals negative absolute value of x plus 1, if you totally got rid of that absolute value and did y equals negative x plus 1, you would be really close to getting the graph. You would be doing plus 1 and negative x. So the thing is, you would only have one side. All the absolute value does is add this second side. That's a reflection. If you've folded it in half, you're getting that reflection on it. Okay, so let's do 24. 24 says y equals 2 absolute value of x minus 5. So what do we know right away? We know that when x equals 0, y equals negative 5. So there is our y-intercept. We know that we've got a 2 here, so it's going to be a steeper slope. If it was a regular one, which means it's going to be a skinnier graph. We know it's positive, so it's going to face up. And so if we were to graph it, we would have y is negative 5. We'd start down here at 0, negative 5. And already, basically, I'm having a slope of 2. So up 2 over 1. Obviously, my graphing skills aren't the best today. So I'm going to have this. So that would be on my initial y equals 2x minus 5. And then I'm going to have that second side in it over here. To find out exactly where our coordinate points are and just double check that that's what our graph should look like, we're going to plug in 0 equals 2 absolute value x minus 5. So when y equals 0, so y is our coordinate point over here, 0, we're going to solve. So I have 5 equals 2 absolute value of x. 5 halves equals absolute value of x. That means x can be both positive 5 halves and negative 5 halves. So we would have 5 halves and negative 5 halves. So I'm going to go at 2.5 here and 2.5 there. Yep. So my sketch initially matched what my points ended up showing. Let me know if you need more help than that.